Good morning. If you have decided to study to become a professional hypnotherapist, it is necessary that you know the past of hypnosis. Let's see the second part of the history of hypnosis, hypnotism. Hypnotism, the golden years of hypnosis. James Braid, 1795-1860. The Scottish physician James Braid is undoubtedly one of the most outstanding figures in the history of hypnotism. Considered by many as the father of hypnotism, his observations contributed decisively to relegate the fluidistic thesis and the magnetic conception of suggestion. His interest in mesmeric phenomena began when he saw the performance of the famous French magnetizer La Fontaine in Manchester in 1841. In the session, a fact attracted his attention: the impossibility of a patient to open his eyes. Braid noticed that the phenomena produced by his technique of ocular fixation could also occur spontaneously. There is still more. There are individuals so impressionable to suggestions that they can be mastered and controlled even in a state of apparent wakefulness. Braid went so far as to propose that hypnotism was not more than a part of a continuum that ranged from vigil phenomena, waking phenomena, to hypnotic coma, loss of all will, passing through hypnotism characterized mainly by what the Scotsman called splitting of consciousness. The name of hypnotism will be given to the production of artificial sleep, accompanied by loss of memory, so that on awakening he keeps no memory of what has happened during sleep, but retains the faculty of remembering again, if he is again immersed in a similar hypnotic degree. Although the term hypnotism and later hypnosis was introduced in the scientific literature by the Frenchman Etienne Félix de Haene in 1821, 22 years before being used by Braid, it is from the Scottish doctor's studies when his meaning will be progressively generalized, reaching a certain prestige among the various scientific circles. In his initial formulations on the nature of hypnotism, Braid gave special importance to the psychophysiological process produced by his technique of ocular fixation, as the etiological basis of hypnotism. Over the years, Braid progressively gave great importance to the cognitive subjective aspects of the hypnotic process, highlighting the role of beliefs, attentional variables, and suggestion, as well as the mind-body interaction, to the determinants of the purely pathophysiological aspects of the process. In this sense, Braid can be considered as a precursor of modern conceptions on the importance of the role of selective attention and attentional focus in the hypnotic process. From this point on, two perspectives will be permanently in dispute: the pathophysiological perspective and the physiological perspective. From Braid's death in 1860 until 1880, both magnetism and hypnotism were considerably discredited. It would take a few more years for hypnotism to be progressively accepted in the intellectual circles of the time. The preparatory conditions would be the development of French Braidism or hypnotism, and the assimilation of British psychophysiology by the scientific environment of Paris. From then on, the theoretical controversy would be centered in the fields of the nascent psychiatry and psychology. In particular, the struggle would crystallize in the dialectical battles between the school of Salpêtrière and the school of Nancy. This polemic, which we will deal with later, is not only relevant in the history of hypnosis, but also for the development of modern psychopathology and psychotherapy. At the end of the 19th century, especially from 1882 onwards, hypnosis, or more commonly called at the time hypnotism, was one of the most notable areas of scientific interest. Auguste Ambroise Lebault, 1823–1904. Auguste Ambroise Lebault was a simple country doctor who practiced in the village of Pont Saint-Vincent, near the city of Nancy, France. Among other merits, he would be the spiritual father of what became known as the School of Nancy, which, although more poorly organized than its homonyme in Paris, the School of Salpêtrière, would be the main architects of the counterpoints of the theoretical controversy of hypnosis at the end of the 19th century. Liebold was interested in animal magnetism since his days as a medical student in Strasbourg, often practicing and performing variations and combinations of various techniques. Liebold spent much time experimenting with what we called the mixed method, with his own patients, whom he treated as a country doctor, and, optionally, he hypnotized without charging them a fee. Eventually, he published his work on hypnotism, where he argued that artificial sleep was essentially identical to natural sleep, so it should be considered as a normal state, where the patient is influenced by the operator through persistent ideas related to sleep, drowsiness, and focus of attention. For Liebold, hypnotism was characterized by a state where the capacities were considerably increased, all favored by the phenomenon of concentration of attention or state of inertia of attention, which the French physician called charme, and which could be manipulated through verbal suggestion. Jean-Martin Charcot, 1825–1893, and the Salpêtrière School. The Salpêtrière School in Paris was made up of a whole series of physicians led by Jean-Martin Charcot, including Sigmund Freud, 1865–1939. Charcot was considered the most important eminent neurologist of his time. Around 1870, Charcot oversaw a special ward of the hospital, reserved for the hysterical and epileptical patients, which is why he extended his studies of anatomic pathology of the nervous system to hysterical disorders. Probably under the influence of the psychologist and Nobel Prize winner Charles Richet, Charcot began to use hypnotism to provoke hysterical phenomena in his experiences. Hypnotism was considered from the very beginning by Charcot's school as a precious mine to be exploited by the physiologists, the psychologists, and the physicians alike. At the beginning of 1882, Charcot presented his conclusion to the French Academy of Sciences. According to his observations, these nervous states are three: the cataleptic state, the lethargic state, the somnambulism state. Each of them can present itself in a primitive form and persist in isolation. It can also be provoked successively during a single observation of the same patient, in orders, according to the desire of the observer. His academic reputation allowed hypnotism, until rejected by orthodox science, to be finally accepted, favoring the publication of a great number of works on the subject. Therefore, this period is known as the Belle Époque of hypnosis. The conclusions on hypnosis obtained by Charcot and his disciples became paradigmatic for a great number of practitioners of the time. The postulates of the Salpêtrière School, the somatic indicators that take place in some subjects under hypnosis, are of fundamental importance because they provide legitimate evidence of the absence of simulation. The hypnotic phenomena can present a special grouping in three distinct stages: catalepsy, lethargy, and somnambulism. This is the most perfect form of hypnotism, which should be taken at the time and which we propose to call great hypnotism. The manifestation of hypnotism and great hypnotism can be developed independently of all suggestion. Hypnotism in its purest form must be considered as a pathological state. Hippolyte Bernheim, 1840–1990, and the School of Nancy. Hippolyte Bernheim, a physician of French origin, was appointed professor of medical clinic at the Faculty of Medicine of Nancy in 1879. His interest in hypnosis and suggestion would come about 10 years later, in 1882, when one of his patients suffering from sciatica was treated with remarkable success by Auguste O. Liebold. Bernheim, after hearing of the clinical success obtained by the country doctor, attended several demonstrations of the latter and convinced of the therapeutic potential of hypnotism, began to study and practice it. In 1884, he published his first work on the subject, in which he presented an extensive study on suggestibility and its degrees, in 1.040 patients and voluntary subjects. After the publication of his work, Ribauld's thesis began to spread in the academic environment of the area, gaining followers. Bernheim proposed a conception of hypnotism diametrically opposed to that of Charcot. This conception is based on suggestion and suggestibility as fundamental elements of hypnosis. The phenomena determined in the hypnotic state and in the waking state are not due to magnetic fluid, to any emanation going from one organism to another, but everything comes from suggestion, that is to say, from the influence provoked by an idea suggested and accepted by the brain. What they admire most in the sleeper is his automatism. His catalepsy is suggestive. The attitude given to him, he perceives it. The movements indicated to him, he continues them. The sensation instilled into his brain, he perceives them. Images deposited in him, he realizes them and makes them visible. The conclusions they draw are: suggestibility is found in non-hypnotized persons as much as in hypnotized subjects. In each case, it is present in different degrees. Hypnosis is in the state of heightened suggestibility par excellence. Hypnosis is a physiological state which can only be obtained by means of appropriate suggestions. Hypnosis has degrees of depth which can be measured by the suggestibility of the hypnotized subject. In time, Bernheim came to attach so much importance to suggestion that he gradually restricted the use of hypnosis, to the point that any hypnotic effects could be produced by waking suggestion. In fact, he developed a certain systematic methodology, which he called psychotherapy. Thus, to a certain extent, Bernheim may have been one of the first founders of psychotherapy as we understand it today. The School of Nancy versus the School of Salpetriere. The dialectical disputes between Nancy and Salpetriere were numerous and varied. An exhaustive analysis of them would far exceed the limits of this video and would not make particularly relevant contributions as far as the nature of suggestion and hypnosis is considered, because essentially the positions in dispute have already been clearly exposed above. But it is true that these disputes have marked historical interest for the birth of psychology as a science, because they involved the change of mentality from essentially static, localizationist and anatomo-clinical conceptions of the mental illness towards more psychologist, dynamic and integrative conceptions. Briefly, the beginning of the dispute is already centered in 1884, when Paul Janet opened fire to the first time against the thesis of Ribauld and Bernheim. The dialectical confrontation would mainly revolve around three topics: the relationship between hypnotism and hysteria, and the stages of hypnotism proposed by Charcot, the role of suggestion and suggestibility, and the medico-legal implications of the responsibility for the acts of hypnotized subjects. From then on, and especially after Charcot's death in 1893, Bernheim began to be really considered among the scientists of the time. Thus, his thesis influenced several authors who visited Nancy more frequently and, in turn, became precursors of modern psychiatry and psychology. In fact, the controversy eventually settled on the side of Bernheim and the Nancy School. In fact, their conceptions on suggestion and hypnosis are still valid today, while the theses of Charcot and his followers have been reputed and relegated to the history of psychopathology. The decline of hypnosis. The Renaissance psychology of the end of the 19th century showed great confusion, even among the tendencies that characterized the so-called science of mental life. With the Nancy-Salpeter dispute settled, the door was opened to the development of psychotherapy and the dawn of psychoanalysis. In the transition to the 20th century, at least three clearly differentiated psychological research practices coexisted. The German experimental model, the best exponent of which was Wilhelm Wundt. The British model for the evaluation of mental abilities. And the clinical model based on the experimental study of suggestion and hypnosis, led by Hippolyte Bernheim's thesis. And hypnotism and suggestion were not prepared to assume such changes. At the turn of the century, there was a recession in the use of hypnosis techniques. In our opinion, the death of Charcot, the increasingly widespread application of chemical anesthetics, and the virtual non-existence of replicable experimental data on the clinical effects of hypnosis favored that the community of scientists, especially psychologists, relegated to hypnosis to merely anecdotal considerations. And at that time, hypnosis was not among the psychological phenomena that could be studied according to the norms of the most rigorous experimental methodology. In fact, the scientific situation of hypnosis became so precarious that in the 20s there were practically no relevant publications. If you have doubts, ask them in the comments area. On this topic and many others we will talk about in the channel and in the videos we will publish. So if you are interested, do not miss our next videos. Thank you very much.